In the depths of ancient Chinese palaces, emperors would perform sacred rituals to summon the Dragon Kings, powerful deities who controlled the rain, ruled the seas, and held the power of life and death over millions of people through their command of water itself. For thousands of years, the Dragon Kings have been among the most feared and revered deities in Chinese mythology, commanding respect from peasants and emperors alike as the supernatural rulers of water in all its forms. But here's what will fascinate you. The Dragon Kings weren't just mythological figures used to explain natural phenomena. They represented a sophisticated understanding of hydrology, political power, and the relationship between humanity and nature that shaped Chinese civilization and continues to influence East Asian culture today. Welcome to History Unleashed, where we explore the myths, legends, and historical realities that have shaped civilizations across the globe. I'm your host, and today we're diving into the powerful world of China's Dragon Kings. From their ancient origins in pre-dynastic shamanism to their central role in imperial religion. From their association with weather control to their continuing presence in modern Chinese culture. If you're ready to discover the truth behind one of China's most enduring and powerful mythological traditions, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what we're about to reveal will show you how the Dragon Kings shaped everything from imperial legitimacy to agricultural practices, and why understanding them is essential to understanding Chinese civilization itself. So prepare yourself for a journey into the realm where mythology meets history, where divine power controlled earthly survival, and where the Dragon Kings reigned supreme over the element that made Chinese civilization possible. The story of the Dragon Kings begins not with organized religion or imperial mythology, but deep in the prehistoric past of Chinese civilization, where ancient peoples developed complex beliefs about serpentine water spirits that controlled rivers, lakes, and rainfall upon which their survival depended. These early dragon beliefs emerged from the practical observations of agricultural communities, who recognized that water, its presence or absence, determined whether they would feast or starve, whether their communities would flourish or collapse under the weight of drought or devastating floods. The archaeological evidence for early dragon worship in China extends back thousands of years to the Neolithic period, with artifacts like the famous Hongshan jade dragons dating to approximately 4500 BCE demonstrating that dragon imagery and possibly dragon veneration were already well established in Chinese culture long before the emergence of written records or centralized states. These early dragons bore characteristics that would persist throughout Chinese history: elongated serpentine bodies, associations with water and weather, and connections to shamanic practices and spiritual power. The etymology of the Chinese character for dragon, long, reveals important insights into how ancient Chinese peoples conceptualize these beings, as the character's components suggest associations with rain, clouds, and supernatural power that reflect the dragon's fundamental role as controller of water and weather. The evolution of this character through various script forms demonstrates the centralization and standardization of dragon concepts as Chinese civilization became more unified and literate. The regional variations in early dragon worship across ancient China reflect the diverse geographical and environmental conditions that shape different communities, relationships with water, and their need for supernatural intervention to ensure adequate rainfall and prevent devastating floods. Coastal communities developed different dragon traditions than those along major rivers or in the agricultural plains, creating a rich tapestry of local dragon beliefs that would eventually be synthesized into more standardized imperial mythology. The shamanic origins of dragon worship are evident in early Chinese religious practices that involve spirit mediums, rain dances, and elaborate rituals designed to communicate with and influence dragon spirits that controlled weather and water. These shamanic traditions, which persisted alongside and within more organized religious systems, suggest that dragon worship served practical purposes related to community survival and agricultural success rather than purely spiritual or philosophical functions. The transformation of dragons from local water spirits to organized deities with specific names, domains, and hierarchical relationships occurred gradually as Chinese civilization became more complex and centralized. The emergence of the concept of dragon kings as opposed to undifferentiated dragon spirits reflects the increasing sophistication of Chinese religious thought, and the influence of political organization on mythological structures. The philosophical dimensions of dragon symbolism in early Chinese thought connected these creatures to fundamental concepts about the relationship between heaven and earth, the nature of power and legitimacy, and the cosmic order that governed both natural phenomena and human society. Dragons became associated with the Yang principle, masculine creative energy, imperial authority, and the transformative power that could bridge different realms of existence. Here's something that reveals how mythology develops from environmental necessity. From which country are you watching this? Because cultures worldwide have created powerful water deities or spirits that reflect their dependence on and relationship with water resources. What water-related deities or myths are important in your cultural tradition? And how do they reflect your region's environmental conditions? Share your insights in the comments. The integration of dragon worship with ancestor veneration and other foundational elements of Chinese religious practice created syncretic traditions that allowed dragons to function simultaneously as nature spirits, ancestral deities, and cosmic forces. This integration demonstrates the flexibility and adaptability of Chinese religious thought, which has historically been comfortable with multiplicity and ambiguity rather than demanding strict, categorical distinctions between different types of spiritual beings. The role of dragons in early Chinese political legitimation became increasingly important as rulers sought supernatural sanction for their authority, claiming connections to dragon spirits or even dragon ancestry to demonstrate their fitness to rule. The association between dragons and legitimate political authority would become one of the most enduring and important aspects of dragon mythology throughout Chinese imperial history. The artistic representations of early dragons in jade, bronze, ceramic, and textile demonstrate the central importance of these beings to Chinese material culture and aesthetic traditions. The evolution of dragon imagery reflects changing artistic styles and technical capabilities while maintaining fundamental iconographic elements that made dragons immediately recognizable and symbolically powerful across different media and historical periods. The textual evidence for early dragon beliefs appears in some of China's oldest literary works, including references in the Book of Changes, I Ching, and the classic of poetry, Xi Jing, which describe dragons in ways that reveal their established place in early Chinese cosmology and their association with imperial power, natural phenomena, and spiritual transformation. The systematization of dragon worship into the cult of the four dragon kings represents one of the most significant developments in Chinese religious history, transforming diverse local dragon spirits into an organized pantheon with clear jurisdictions, hierarchical relationships, and standardized ritual practices. This development occurred gradually over centuries as Chinese civilization became more unified, and as the imperial government sought to standardize and control religious practices throughout its territories. The four dragon kings, as they eventually became established in classical Chinese mythology, were Ao Guang, Dragon King of the Eastern Sea; Ao Qin, Dragon King of the Southern Sea; Ao Run, Dragon King of the Western Sea; and Ao Shun, Dragon King of the Northern Sea. Each ruled over his respective oceanic domain, while also possessing authority over the rivers, lakes, and weather systems within his geographic jurisdiction, creating a comprehensive system of supernatural water management that paralleled and supported earthly governmental structures. The characteristics and personalities attributed to each Dragon King reflected both geographical factors and cultural associations with the cardinal directions that structured Chinese spatial and cosmological thinking. The Eastern Dragon King was often portrayed as the most senior and powerful, reflecting the historical importance of the eastern regions in Chinese cultural development and the association of the East with spring, renewal, and the rising sun. The palaces of the Dragon Kings, as described in Chinese mythology and literature, were magnificent underwater realms filled with treasure, inhabited by countless dragon relatives and retainers, and organized according to bureaucratic principles that mirrored earthly imperial administration. These elaborate descriptions of dragon palace architecture, administration, and daily life provided imaginative settings for countless stories, while also reinforcing ideas about proper governance and social organization. The hierarchical organization of the dragon realm placed the four dragon kings at the top of a complex administrative system that included numerous lesser dragons, each with specific duties related to managing particular bodies of water or weather phenomena. This bureaucratic conception of the supernatural realm reflected Chinese cultural preferences for order, hierarchy, and administrative efficiency, while also providing a framework for understanding how natural processes were controlled and directed. The iconographic representation of the dragon kings in art and literature followed conventional patterns that made them immediately recognizable, while also allowing for individual variations that distinguished one king from another. Typically, depicted as powerful elderly men with dragon features or the ability to transform between human and dragon forms, the kings embodied both authority and the dangerous unpredictability of water and weather. The ritual obligations imposed on the dragon kings by higher cosmic authorities, particularly the Jade Emperor who ruled the celestial bureaucracy, created a cosmological system in which even these powerful beings were subject to divine law and cosmic order. This hierarchy reinforced Confucian values about duty, proper behavior, and the subordination of individual will to larger social and cosmic structures. The relationships between the four dragon kings were portrayed as generally harmonious, but occasionally competitive, with stories describing disputes over jurisdiction, accusations of improper behavior, and interventions by higher authorities to resolve conflicts. These narratives provided entertaining drama while also illustrating principles of conflict resolution and proper administration. Here's something that shows how religious systems mirror political structures. From which country are you watching this? Because many cultures have created supernatural bureaucracies or hierarchies that reflect earthly governmental organization. What examples can you think of from your cultural or religious tradition where the divine realm is organized similarly to human political systems? Share your observations in the comments. The seasonal and directional associations of the dragon kings connected them to the Chinese understanding of time and space as organized according to the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, and their corresponding directions, colors, and seasonal influences. This integration of dragon worship with fundamental Chinese cosmological principles made the kings essential components of the conceptual framework that structured Chinese understanding of the natural world. The literary prominence of the dragon kings reached its height in classical Chinese novels like Journey to the West and Investiture of the Gods, which featured extended episodes set in dragon palaces and elaborate interactions between the kings and various heroes, immortals, and deities. These literary representations both drew upon and shaped popular understanding of the dragon kings, creating narrative traditions that influenced Chinese literature for centuries. The folk religious practices centered on the dragon kings often diverged from official imperial cult worship, with local communities developing their own traditions, festivals, and ritual practices that addressed their specific needs and reflected their particular relationships with water and weather. These folk traditions demonstrated the vitality and adaptability of dragon king worship beyond the formal structures of state religion. The gender dimensions of dragon king mythology typically portrayed the kings as male, while also including female dragons in supporting roles as wives, daughters, or attendants. This gender structure reflected broader Chinese patriarchal social organization, while also allowing for stories about dragon women who occasionally played significant roles in narratives about romance, family conflicts, and the boundaries between human and dragon realms. The dragon king's most fundamental and important power was their control over water in all its forms. From the vast oceans they ruled to the rivers that sustained agricultural civilizations, from the rainfall that made crops possible to the devastating floods that could destroy entire regions. This control over water made the dragon kings arguably the most practically important deities in the Chinese pantheon, as their favor or disfavor could determine whether communities prospered or perished, whether dynasties rose or fell based on their ability to feed their populations. The mechanisms by which dragon kings were believed to control weather involved complex interactions between their underwater palaces, celestial authorities, and earthly conditions. According to traditional beliefs, the kings maintained vast reservoirs of water in their ocean palaces and could command their subordinates to release water as rain, create clouds, or withhold precipitation to cause drought depending on various factors including proper ritual offerings, moral behavior of human populations, and directives from higher cosmic authorities. The association between dragons and clouds in Chinese thought created a rich symbolic system in which clouds were understood as visible manifestations of dragon power, with different cloud formations indicating different types of dragon activity or the presence of particular dragons. This cloud symbolism appeared throughout Chinese art, literature, and decorative traditions, making dragons and clouds an inseparable pairing in Chinese visual culture. The practical importance of Dragon King worship for Chinese agriculture cannot be overstated, as successful farming in many regions of China depended on adequate and timely rainfall that only the Dragon Kings could provide. Farmers throughout China participated in rituals, festivals, and offerings designed to ensure the king's favor and secure the rainfall necessary for successful harvests, making Dragon King worship a matter of immediate, practical concern rather than abstract, spiritual practice. The drought relief ceremonies performed throughout Chinese history when rainfall failed represented some of the most elaborate and desperate religious rituals in Chinese culture, as communities facing crop failure and starvation would conduct increasingly elaborate ceremonies to attract the Dragon King's attention and secure their intervention. These ceremonies often involved imperial participation, massive processions, animal sacrifices, and public displays of penance and humility before the powerful water deities. The flood control dimension of Dragon King worship reflected the dual nature of water as both life-giving and destructive force, as the same kings who could provide beneficial rain could also unleash devastating floods that destroyed crops, homes, and lives. The propitiation of Dragon Kings to prevent excessive flooding was as important as seeking their aid during droughts, creating religious practices that addressed both extremes of water's power. The connection between Dragon King worship and river management created interesting interactions between religious practice and hydraulic engineering, as communities and governments invested enormous resources in both ritual activities and practical construction projects designed to manage water resources effectively. The relationship between these two approaches, religious and technical, reveals important aspects of Chinese cultural pragmatism and the integration of spiritual and material concerns. Here's something that demonstrates how religion addresses practical survival needs. From which country are you watching this? Because agricultural societies worldwide have developed religious practices focused on ensuring adequate water for crops and preventing destructive floods. How have religious traditions in your region addressed water management and weather control? Share your cultural practices in the comments. The climatological factors that affected Dragon King worship's intensity and character varied significantly across China's diverse geography, with regions that experienced regular rainfall developing different ritual traditions than areas prone to drought or flooding. This geographical variation created regional differences in how Dragon Kings were understood, worshipped, and depicted. While maintaining core beliefs about their fundamental nature and powers, the seasonal dimensions of Dragon King worship created annual ritual calendars that aligned religious observances with agricultural cycles and weather patterns. Spring ceremonies often focused on securing adequate rainfall for planting. Summer rituals addressed concerns about drought during growing seasons, and autumn observances expressed gratitude for successful harvests while preparing for winter's challenges. The personal character and moral qualities attributed to individual Dragon Kings influenced how communities understood their relationships with these deities and how they approached ritual obligations. Some kings were portrayed as benevolent and responsive to proper offerings, while others were depicted as temperamental or easily offended, requiring especially careful and elaborate propitiation to secure their cooperation. The punishment powers attributed to Dragon Kings allowed them to serve as instruments of divine justice, with beliefs holding that the kings could cause localized droughts or floods to punish communities for moral failings, improper ritual observance, or disrespectful behavior toward water and natural resources. This moralistic dimension of Dragon King worship reinforced social norms and encouraged proper behavior through fear of supernatural punishment. The relationship between Dragon King worship and Chinese concepts of harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity made the kings important symbols of the proper balance that should exist between human activity and natural processes. Disruptions to this harmony, whether through moral corruption, improper ritual practice, or environmental destruction, could anger the Dragon Kings and result in water-related disasters that would only be resolved through restoration of proper balance. The integration of Dragon King worship into imperial state religion represented a crucial development that transformed local water spirit veneration into a centralized cult that served important political functions while also attempting to standardize and control religious practices throughout the Chinese Empire. The imperial government's sponsorship and regulation of Dragon King worship reflected broader patterns of state religious management in which the government sought to harness supernatural power for political purposes while preventing religious practices from challenging imperial authority. The official titles and ranks bestowed upon Dragon Kings by imperial decree created a formal hierarchy that incorporated these deities into the celestial bureaucracy that paralleled and legitimized earthly governmental structures. Emperors could promote Dragon Kings to higher ranks, grant them additional titles, or even demote them for failing to provide adequate rainfall or preventing floods, demonstrating imperial authority over even powerful supernatural beings. The imperial dragon temples, Longwang Miao, constructed throughout China served as official sites for state-sponsored Dragon King worship and provided architectural expressions of the cult's importance to imperial religion. These temples followed standardized designs that reflected their status as state religious institutions while also incorporating regional variations that acknowledged local dragon traditions and environmental conditions. The ritual calendar of imperial Dragon King worship included fixed annual ceremonies performed by government officials at designated temples as well as special rituals conducted in response to droughts, floods, or other water-related crises. These rituals followed prescribed liturgies that had been officially approved and codified, creating standardized practices that distinguished imperial cult worship from more varied folk religious traditions. The selection and training of priests who staffed imperial dragon temples reflected government efforts to ensure proper ritual performance while also maintaining ideological control over religious practices. These priests underwent examination and certification processes similar to those used for civil service officials, creating a religious bureaucracy that paralleled secular administrative structures. The offerings presented to Dragon Kings in imperial rituals ranged from incense and prayers to elaborate animal sacrifices and valuable objects that demonstrated imperial wealth and respect for the deity's power. The types and quantities of offerings were carefully regulated by government protocols that specified appropriate practices for different types of ceremonies and different levels of governmental participation. The participation of emperors themselves in Dragon King rituals during times of severe drought or flooding represented the highest level of imperial engagement with these deities and demonstrated the political importance of water management to imperial legitimacy. Imperial drought relief ceremonies could involve the emperor performing public acts of humility and penance to demonstrate his recognition of failures in governance that had led to divine displeasure manifesting as water crisis. Here's something that shows how religious authority reinforces political power. From which country are you watching this? Because rulers throughout history have used religious institutions and practices to legitimize their authority and demonstrate their connection to divine power. What examples can you think of from your region where political and religious authority were closely intertwined? Share your observations in the comments. The ideological functions of imperial Dragon King worship extended beyond practical concerns about water management to encompass broader messages about cosmic order, proper governance, and the emperor's role as intermediary between heaven and earth. The rituals reinforced Confucian values about hierarchy, duty, and the moral foundations of legitimate authority while also incorporating Taoist and Buddhist elements that reflected China's religious pluralism. The regional administration of imperial Dragon King worship created complex relationships between central government, religious policies, and local practices, as provincial and local officials were responsible for conducting proper rituals while also managing their region's actual water resources through hydraulic engineering projects. The integration of religious and technical approaches to water management reflected Chinese cultural pragmatism and the recognition that supernatural and material methods could be complementary rather than contradictory. The documentation of imperial Dragon King rituals in official records provides valuable historical sources for understanding both the religious practices themselves and the broader social and environmental conditions that made these practices necessary. Imperial records of drought relief ceremonies, flood control rituals, and responses to water crises reveal important information about historical climate patterns, agricultural conditions, and governmental responses to environmental challenges. The criticism of excessive Dragon King worship by some Confucian scholars reflected intellectual debates about the proper role of religious practices in governance and society. Some critics argued that resources devoted to elaborate rituals would be better spent on practical hydraulic engineering projects, while defenders of the cult maintained that ritual and technical approaches were complementary strategies for managing water resources. The persistence of imperial Dragon King worship throughout Chinese dynastic history, from early imperial periods through the Qing dynasty's fall in 1912, demonstrates the cult's enduring importance and its successful adaptation to changing political circumstances. Different dynasties modified and elaborated the cult according to their particular needs and ideological orientations, while maintaining its core functions and beliefs. The representation of Dragon Kings in Chinese literature created rich narrative traditions that shaped popular understanding of these deities, while also providing vehicles for exploring themes related to power, justice, family relationships, and the boundaries between human and supernatural realms. The most famous literary portrayals appeared in classical novels like Journey to the West, Xiyuji, and Investiture of the Gods, Feng Shenyan Yi, which featured extended episodes set in dragon palaces and complex interactions between dragon kings and various protagonists. Dragon King episodes in Journey to the West include some of the most memorable scenes in Chinese literature, particularly the story of Sun Wukong, the ID Monkey King, visiting the Eastern Sea Dragon Palace to obtain a magical weapon and his subsequent conflicts with various Dragon Kings. These episodes demonstrate the dragon's power while also showing their vulnerability to more powerful beings, creating narrative tensions that explore themes of authority, respect, and cosmic hierarchy. The character development of Dragon Kings in literature often portrayed them as complex figures with both admirable and problematic qualities. Powerful and dignified, but also sometimes bureaucratic, legalistic, or overly concerned with protocol at the expense of justice or compassion. These characterizations made the dragons interesting literary figures, while also allowing authors to comment on earthly governmental practices through supernatural allegory. The family dynamics portrayed in Dragon Palace stories reflected and reinforced Chinese cultural values about filial piety, proper family relationships, and the tensions between individual desires and family obligations. Stories about dragon sons and daughters often explored themes of intergenerational conflict, arranged marriages, and the sacrifices required to maintain family honor and social position. The visual representation of Dragon Kings in Chinese art followed iconographic conventions that made these figures immediately recognizable while also allowing for considerable artistic variation and creativity. Paintings, sculptures, and decorative arts depicted the kings in various contexts, enthroned in their underwater palaces, emerging from waves, participating in celestial assemblies, or interacting with human supplicants. The artistic symbolism associated with Dragon Kings extended beyond direct representations to include various objects, creatures, and motifs that signified their presence or power. Clouds, waves, pearls, and various aquatic creatures all carried associations with dragon power and frequently appeared in artistic compositions that referenced the kings without necessarily depicting them directly. The theatrical traditions that incorporated Dragon King characters created distinctive performance styles, costumes, and staging conventions that brought these deities to life in ways that complemented but differed from literary and artistic representations. Chinese opera and other dramatic forms developed elaborate Dragon King scenes that demonstrated the performers' skills while entertaining audiences with spectacular displays of costuming and stage effects. Here's something that demonstrates how mythology permeates artistic traditions. From which country are you watching this? Because cultures worldwide have created rich artistic traditions based on their mythological figures and religious beliefs. What mythological characters from your cultural tradition have inspired significant literary, visual, or performing arts. Share your cultural art forms in the comments. The folk narrative traditions about dragon kings often diverged from elite literary and artistic representations, with oral storytelling traditions preserving local variations and emphasizing different aspects of dragon mythology that reflected common people's concerns and relationships with these deities. These folk traditions demonstrate the vitality of dragon king beliefs beyond formal religious and literary contexts. The evolution of dragon king representations across different historical periods reveals changing cultural attitudes, artistic styles, and religious sensibilities that influenced how these deities were understood and portrayed. Earlier representations often emphasized the dragon's frightening power and alien nature, while later depictions sometimes portrayed them more sympathetically, as complex characters with recognizably human emotions and motivations. The influence of Buddhist and Taoist traditions on dragon king representations created syncretic artistic and literary forms that incorporated elements from multiple religious traditions. Buddhist sutra illustrations might include dragons as protectors of the Dharma, while Taoist religious art portrayed dragons as participants in cosmic processes and companions to immortals. The decorative arts applications of dragon king imagery transformed religious symbols into aesthetic elements that adorned everything, from imperial robes to architectural details, from ceramic vessels to textile patterns. This widespread use of dragon motifs demonstrated their cultural importance, while also creating visual environments saturated with symbols of power, authority, and cosmic order. The regional variations in dragon king artistic and literary traditions reflected local cultural characteristics, historical experiences, and environmental conditions that shaped how different communities understood and represented these deities. Coastal regions might emphasize the king's oceanic aspects, while inland areas focused more on their control over rivers and rainfall. The folk religious practices centered on dragon kings developed independently of and in complex relationship with imperial state religion, creating diverse local traditions that addressed communities' specific needs while also maintaining connections to broader Chinese religious culture. These folk practices demonstrated remarkable creativity, adaptability, and persistence, surviving political changes and religious reforms that attempted to standardize or suppress unorthodox ritual activities. The Dragon Boat Festival, Duan Wujai, celebrated on the 5th day of the 5th lunar month, represents the most famous and enduring Dragon King-related folk festival, though its origins and meanings extend beyond dragon worship to include commemoration of the poet Qu Yuan and various other cultural and seasonal observances. The festival's dragon boat races symbolically reenact dragons moving through water and demonstrate communities' relationships with these powerful deities. The dragon boat races themselves involve elaborately decorated boats with dragon heads and tails, rowed by teams who compete while accompanied by drummers who maintain rhythm and encourage the rowers. These races combine athletic competition with ritual performance, entertainment with religious observance, creating community celebrations that strengthen social bonds while honoring the dragon kings. The local dragon temples maintained by communities throughout China served as focal points for folk religious practices that often diverged from standardized imperial cult worship. These temples reflected local architectural traditions, incorporated regional variations in ritual practice, and addressed specific community concerns about water management, fishing, agriculture, and other activities affected by dragon power. The votive offerings presented to dragon kings in folk religious contexts ranged from simple incense and paper money to elaborate theatrical performances, animal sacrifices, and valuable objects that demonstrated devotion and sought the deity's favor. The types of offerings reflected both traditional prescriptions and local innovations that communities believed would be effective in securing dragon assistance. The rainmaking rituals performed by communities during droughts represented some of the most desperate and elaborate folk religious practices, as people facing crop failure and starvation would employ increasingly extreme methods to attract dragon kings' attention. These rituals might include processions carrying dragon images, public prayers and demonstrations of penance, offerings of food and valuables, and various activities believed to be particularly effective in moving the dragons to provide rainfall. The rain processions involved carrying statues or images of dragon kings through communities and surrounding fields while participants prayed, made offerings, and performed ritual actions designed to demonstrate need and devotion. These processions created powerful, communal experiences that reinforce social solidarity while addressing practical concerns about water supply. Here's something that shows how religious practices bind communities together. From which country are you watching this? Because communal religious festivals and rituals create shared experiences that strengthen social bonds while addressing practical needs. What community festivals or rituals in your cultural tradition serve similar functions of bringing people together while honoring important deities or commemorating significant events? Share your cultural practices in the comments. The shamanic elements that persisted in folk Dragon King worship maintained ancient traditions that preceded organized religious institutions and provided direct channels of communication between humans and dragons. Spirit mediums might claim to be possessed by dragon kings or their representatives, conveying messages and instructions that guided community ritual practices and water management decisions. The integration of Dragon King worship with other folk religious practices created syncretic traditions that combined elements from Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and local animistic beliefs. This religious pluralism characterized Chinese folk religion generally and demonstrated cultural comfort with multiplicity and the incorporation of elements from diverse sources into functional religious systems. The gender aspects of folk Dragon King worship sometimes allowed women significant roles as ritual specialists, spirit mediums, or organizers of religious activities, despite the generally patriarchal character of Chinese society. These female religious roles provided opportunities for authority and public activity that were otherwise limited in traditional Chinese gender relations. The commercial dimensions of folk Dragon King worship created economic networks involving the production of religious objects, the organization of festivals, and the provision of ritual services by religious specialists. These commercial activities supported livelihoods while also facilitating religious practices and creating economic incentives for maintaining traditions. The adaptations of Dragon King worship to address modern concerns demonstrate the continuing vitality of these traditions and their ability to remain relevant despite dramatic social and technological changes. Contemporary communities might seek dragons' assistance with environmental pollution, urban flooding, or other challenges that ancient practitioners could never have imagined. The transformation of Dragon King beliefs from living religious practice to cultural heritage represents one of the most significant changes affecting Chinese religious traditions in the modern era. As political movements, scientific education, and social modernization have challenged traditional religious beliefs, while also creating new contexts in which dragon mythology maintains cultural significance. The complex legacy of Dragon King worship demonstrates both the decline of traditional religious practices and the persistence of cultural symbols that continue to carry meaning for contemporary Chinese people. The impact of communist revolution and subsequent religious reforms on Dragon King worship was dramatic, as government policies attempted to eliminate superstitious religious practices and replace them with scientific worldviews and socialist ideology. Many dragon temples were destroyed or repurposed, ritual practices were suppressed, and public dragon worship largely disappeared from mainland China during periods of most intensive anti-religious campaigns. The preservation of Dragon King traditions in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and overseas Chinese communities created important repositories for religious practices that largely disappeared from mainland China during the mid-20th century. These communities maintained temple rituals, festivals, and other practices that kept Dragon King worship alive as functioning religious tradition, rather than merely historical artifact. The revival of interest in traditional culture since China's reform era has created new opportunities for Dragon King worship to reemerge, though often in modified forms that emphasize cultural heritage and local identity, rather than religious belief in the dragon's literal existence or supernatural powers. This cultural revival has led to temple reconstruction, festival revivals, and increased scholarly attention to dragon mythology. The environmental symbolism of Dragon Kings has gained new relevance in an era of climate change, water pollution, and ecological crisis, as some contemporary advocates use traditional dragon mythology to promote environmental protection and sustainable water management. This modern adaptation of ancient symbols demonstrates cultural continuity while addressing contemporary challenges that ancient practitioners could never have anticipated. The tourist industry's exploitation of Dragon King imagery and traditions has created both opportunities for cultural preservation and concerns about commodification that strips religious practices of their spiritual significance while retaining only their entertainment and commercial value. Dragon-themed tourist attractions, festivals marketed to visitors, and commercialized dragon imagery create complicated relationships between authentic tradition and constructed heritage. The influence of Dragon King mythology on contemporary Chinese popular culture appears in films, television shows, video games, and other media that reinterpret traditional stories for modern audiences. These cultural productions demonstrate the enduring appeal of dragon mythology while also revealing how ancient themes are adapted to address contemporary concerns and entertainment preferences. Here's something that shows how ancient traditions adapt to modern contexts. From which country are you watching this? Because traditional religious and mythological figures worldwide have been reinterpreted for contemporary purposes, from environmental advocacy to popular entertainment. What examples can you think of from your cultural tradition where ancient beliefs or figures have been given new meanings or applications in modern society? Share your observations in the comments. The scholarly study of Dragon King traditions has expanded significantly as historians, anthropologists, and religious studies researchers have recognized the importance of understanding these beliefs for comprehending Chinese civilization more broadly. Academic research has documented regional variations, historical developments, and social functions of dragon worship, while also preserving information about practices that might otherwise be lost. The diaspora transmission of Dragon King traditions demonstrates how Chinese cultural practices have traveled globally and adapted to new environments while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. Chinese communities around the world continue to celebrate dragon boat festivals and maintain other dragon-related practices that affirm cultural identity while introducing these traditions to multicultural contexts. The educational applications of Dragon King mythology have made these traditions resources for teaching about Chinese history, culture, and religion to both Chinese and non-Chinese audiences. Schools, museums, and cultural organizations use dragon mythology to introduce fundamental concepts about Chinese civilization, while engaging interest through compelling stories and impressive artistic representations. The continuing symbolic power of dragons in Chinese culture ensures that Dragon King imagery and concepts remain meaningful even for people who no longer believe in the deities' literal existence or supernatural powers. Dragons serve as symbols of Chinese cultural identity, national pride, and connection to historical traditions that transcend religious belief while maintaining cultural significance. The future of Dragon King traditions will likely involve continued adaptation to changing social conditions, with possible trajectories including further secularization and cultural heritage preservation, potential religious revival in some contexts, and ongoing reinterpretation for contemporary purposes. Whatever forms these traditions take, the enduring presence of dragon mythology demonstrates its deep resonance with fundamental aspects of Chinese culture and its ability to remain meaningful across dramatic historical transformations. As we emerge from the depths where the Dragon Kings hold court, we carry with us insights into one of Chinese civilization's most enduring and powerful mythological traditions, a tradition that reveals how ancient peoples understood their relationship with water, how religion addressed practical survival needs, and how mythology can express sophisticated cultural values and environmental knowledge. We've discovered that the Dragon Kings were never simple superstitions or primitive beliefs, but represented complex understandings of hydrology, political organization, and the delicate balance between human needs and natural forces that determined whether civilizations flourished or collapsed. Their worship combined practical concerns about water management with spiritual beliefs about cosmic order, creating religious traditions that addressed both material and transcendent dimensions of human experience. The legacy of the Dragon Kings extends far beyond their original religious context to encompass their influence on Chinese art, literature, political ideology, and cultural identity. Even as belief in their literal existence has declined, The symbolic power of these ancient deities persists, demonstrating how mythology can remain culturally significant long after its religious functions have been transformed or superseded. Perhaps most importantly, the Dragon Kings remind us that ancient peoples developed sophisticated ways of understanding and responding to environmental challenges, encoding important knowledge about water management, climate patterns, and ecological relationships in religious narratives that served both spiritual and practical purposes. The rituals might seem strange to modern sensibilities, but they represented serious attempts to address real challenges using the conceptual frameworks available to ancient cultures. If you found this exploration of China's Dragon Kings fascinating, make sure you're subscribed to History Unleashed and hit that notification bell, because we're committed to uncovering the truths behind the world's greatest mythologies and revealing how ancient stories continue to shape modern cultures. What aspects of Dragon King mythology do you find most interesting? How do you think these ancient water deities compare to similar figures in other cultural traditions? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what other mythological traditions you'd like us to explore. Remember, behind every myth lies human experience. Behind every legend stands environmental reality, and behind every ancient deity we can find sophisticated attempts to understand and navigate the challenges of existence in a world where survival depended on forces beyond human control. This is History Unleashed, where ancient myths reveal timeless truths about human culture, and where every legend has something important to teach us about the civilizations that created them.